Once again, this is Koyama from Fukushima University. So 1st of April, the government, well, 13th of April, the government has announced the basic policy on the upstreated water discharge. And then there's been a subcommittee on handling of upstreated water for 3 years before that, and I was a member of that. And before that, there was a task force on this issue. As for the subcommittee on handling of upstreated water, it was positioned below the Committee on Contaminated Water, which talked about the impermeable wall. And then on 13th of April, the basic policy on the upstreated water was announced. And why it took so long to come up with the basic policy, and also 30 billion yen or so budget will be allocated for this, and how decisions was made and what was the background. So I would like to explain that as much as I can. With regard to the Alps treated water, as Ando-san has said, it's very, very complicated. And perhaps we weren't sure whether we should discuss in detail. And perhaps some people not sure, but maybe it's been so long they feel they need to support it, or maybe other people feeling otherwise. So I'm sure that opinions are divided. During the past years, with community members and overseas international experts, as well as other sort of people, I have discussed this matter and then decided I should talk about this first. So the discharge into the sea has been decided. You can see A, B, C, D, and basically this D, the treated water treated by UPS will be discharged. And the water A, groundwater, had already been discharged. And if in 2015, and after subdrain was set up, the underground water, if it was below the standard, had been discharged into the sea. And this B, water B, is a contaminated water used for the cooling of the reactor unit. So it's very, very contaminated. And some of the, I think, the people outside Japan are believing that contaminated water B will be discharged into the sea. There was some time after the 2011 that they had to discharge this contaminated water B. However, the ALPS multinuclide removal system was introduced, and then the treatment was conducted using ALPS, and the treated water was stored, and which is called ALPS treated water. And then in 2018, it was found that there are other nuclides that, in addition to tritium, included in the ALPS treated water stored in the tanks. And some people believe that those other nuclides also will be discharged. But this time, it is discussed that the secondary and third treatments will be conducted upon the water, C, ALPS treated water. But amongst those waters, A, B, C, D, we have to first understand exactly where problem lies. So the subcommittee on handling on ALPS treated water issued February 2020 their report, and the recognition of the different types of water need to be enhanced so that there will be sort of meaningful discussions as to whether or not we should discharge the water. Basically, that is the proposal included in the report published in the February this year. Without the recognition amongst the public, people wouldn't really know what kind of water will be discharged, and some people would believe wrongly that the very contaminated water would be discharged. So February, the recommendation by the subcommittee was issued. That was back in 2020 and was before the pandemic. However, because of the pandemic, COVID-19, all other discussions went unnoticed. Then the basic policy was issued this year in April. So it gave the public the impression that everything was decided without the communication with the public. So there are three waters on the slide that we're describing on this slide. I'm excluding underground water. So I'm just talking about the contaminated water, out-treated water, and treated water. So there are three types of waters that we need to understand that they exist. So the treated water and Alps treated water and contaminated water are different. So we should conduct a survey amongst the public to understand just how many percentage of the people do understand the differences. And then in 2020 and 2021, how much improvement has been made in terms of the recognition of the differences amongst the different types of water. And we should really understand that before coming up with the basic policy. That actually was suggested and proposed in the report published in February 2020. I just wanted to raise that issue. So that was the brief background. So basically, March 2011, there was an accident, and then in the decommissioning, we have to use the cooling water that would generate contaminated water, and then landside permeable wall is set up, and then the Alps Treated Water Task Force was established, and a Treated Water Task Force was established, and finally, the subcommittee on handling of Alps-treated water was established in order to determine the way forward. And so since the March 2011, all these measures have been taken. So there's a task force on the landside impermeable wall, followed by the Alps task force, followed by treated task force, and followed by the subcommittee on handling of Alps treated water. And also, it is not mentioned here, but in 2013 and 2014, underground water, groundwater was released because the subdrain had been built. Then the treated water task force came up with the 5 possible solutions for disposal of the treated water. And then when the 5 solutions are explored, what they looked at was the impact on the society, the impact on the affected area, and what are the measures needed. So that's 2016 and then 2020. Over the 3 years and 6 months, the subcommittee on handling of treated water was held to discuss those matters. And then they came up with the report in 2020 February and proposing that 1-year discussion would be needed to enhance the recognition of the Alps-treated water issues. Then the government came up with a basic policy on April 2021. But the February 2020 was the time that after 10 years of the trial of fishing in the community, the fishery community on the Fukushima, they come up with the report on this upstreated water disposal solutions. And then the basic policy came out at the worst timing because it was announced without nurturing, fostering the consensus amongst the stakeholders. So the 5 possible solutions, this came up by a treated water task force in 2016. And they said that the possible solutions would be ground injection and controlled discharge into the sea, discharge as a vapor, discharge as hydrogen, and solidification followed by underground burial. And there also was an option of continue to store in the tanks. But in 2016, the generation of the contaminated water was so rapid that it was inconceivable to choose the option of continue storing in the tanks. So as of 2016, storing the contaminated treated water in tanks was not an option for the task force. So if you look at the 5 different solutions here, so the 3.4 billion is needed for the sea discharge, and then 210 billion for the ground injection. and then 34.9 billion for the vapor discharge, hydrogen discharge 100 billion, and also underground burial is 243.1 billion yen. So it was mentioned that as of 2016, the ocean discharge was a quite high possibility. And when I was invited to the committee, the professionals on the radiation issues as well as the nuclear issues and the physics in task force told me that, for example, Professor Tekia, the Tokyo University, Professor Kainuma, and the sociologists were also invited to form the Alps Treated Water Subcommittee. And over 3 years, we discussed different 5 solutions. And then this is the result we came up with. Currently, the total amount was about 1,000 terabecquerel, with the tanks number of about 1,000. And also back then, the water stored was 1.19 million cubic meters. And then 2021, we knew that the tanks will be full. I think currently it is said that by the end of 2022, all the tanks will be filled with the treated water. So based on that assumptions, they discussed about the building more tanks in the northern area, but due to the legal and regulatory restrictions, it was concluded that they can no longer continue to build the tanks. And so it's either vapor discharge or discharge into the sea that we had to choose from as the potential solutions. Having said that, there were issues because secondary treatment would be needed in the tank, and the water contained multiple nuclei. So the 70% of the water stored in the tanks had the more than the sum of the ratio of concentration 1. And so when we consider the amount we can discharge per year, well, before the accident, they were discharging 2.2 terabecquerel, and the regulatory limit is the 22 terabecquerel per year. So if you are to discharge everything in 10 years, you need to discharge 100 terabecquerel per year. And if you discharge 22 terabecquerel per year, it's going to take 30, 40 years. And so we came up with all these calculations as a subcommittee, and then governments were to make a decision. But before the government made a decision, well, in 2020, during the 2020, there were hearings, meetings held, and the municipalities were against this, and also the fishery community and the other community members were against the discharge into the sea or the vapor. So basically, they were opposed to the ideas of vapor and ocean discharge, and then begged that why not you continue to store in the tanks, or maybe somehow you can bury underground, and please come up with some other solution. That was the first feedback. And then the second point made was that as of 2020, there were no countermeasures presented as to how to mitigate the risks. So they asked to review the possible solutions and they come up with the proper countermeasures. And also the third point made was that how did you form this consensus? We were not involved in the decision-making process, so they were against this. Also, maybe storage and disposal on land should be considered. The site has not been sufficiently considered. And also the fishery community is opposed to this idea because when there was a groundwater issue, they suffered a lot. So they were very much concerned that their voices were ignored. Also, there is a difference of opinion about the safety of tritium. The TEPCO is saying that the secondary treatment will be conducted, but people said, who would believe that? It's very suspicious that the TEPCO will be conducting those treatment properly. also there are other nuclei which will remain. And also they also question the consensus forming method. And there were various countermeasures which were proposed, like setting up the fund or involving the international organizations. But basically, those countermeasures were not so much different from the ones that were proposed in the past. But I think there are 3 points we can consider about the treated water disposal. So those who say that water discharge into the sea is okay, because in other country, this has already been practiced. If it's below the standard, it can be discharged into the sea, and that's practiced by other countries. However, what we have to consider is that Fukushima Daiichi has experienced a severe accident. And the other power stations that are discharging into the sea operating normally, and those waters have not been come into direct contact with the highly contaminated radiation materials. So we have to admit that the Japan is different because it went through the accident. So we really have to be transparent about the efforts we've been made to enhance the safety before discharging into the sea. So to the Japanese public and to the neighboring countries, we need to explain uh, exactly what is going to happen, and just not providing the scientific information. We need to address each and every concerns of the stakeholders. So in addition to the scientific evidence, you need to also address the difference between the normally operated nuclear reactors and the reactors we went through to the accident. Through the accident. Also, with regard to the secondary treatment issue, that if 1,000 tanks need to go through the secondary treatment, currently the most of the waters are yet to be treated through the secondary measure. And so the TEPCO is saying that those water will be treated immediately before the discharge, but the operating power entity is TEPCO. Also, the NRA is regulating and supervising this discharge. And actually, the public hasn't really got the most confidence in what TEPCO has been doing and what NRA has been doing, because the data they have been disclosing has been keep changing. I know that TEPCO is making lots of effort, but lots of important pieces of data came out at the later date. For example, there are other nuclei contained in the upstreated water, and the secondary treatment is needed, and so forth. And currently they are saying they are going to involve IAEA to conduct a review. However, currently the operation and the handling of the upstreated water is not really closely monitored, and that is the fact. Also, currently the 1,000 terabecquerel tritium is in existence, and then they are planning to discharge 22 terabecquerel per year over 30 years. Over the 30 years, there might be some accidents. For example, they may say, we experienced some incident, and sorry, we sort of used the wrong data. Those kind of incidents could always happen during the 30 years. So after 10 years, during the 10 years following uh, the nuclear accident, the local community suffered a lot and worked very hard to restore their livelihood. But during those 30 years, something may happen to sort of nullify everything they did. So just them insisting on safety is not sufficient. It is very easy to count the votes to support or not support this disposal method, discharge method, because the situation may change and then the decision may prove to be wrong. So we need to address exactly what are the issues and concerns of the stakeholders. That's it from me. Thank you.